My name is Zepur Simonian. I'm a supervising research attorney for the Los Angeles Superior Court. And today I am joined with Sarin Keosian, who is a law clerk at the San Francisco Superior Court, Ani Torossian, who's a law clerk at the LA Superior Court, and Judge Armen Tamzarian, who's a judicial officer for the LA Superior Court. We're very excited to have you today. The focus of today's presentation is going to be why clerk for the state trial court. Many of us assume, especially in law school, that especially at career services office or even professors, they typically encourage us to pursue a federal clerkship. And the mindset behind that is once you get a federal clerkship, it opens up opportunities and then you could go into big law as a result. If, let's say, for some reason, you didn't take the big law route immediately. We want to give you a different perspective of why, while a federal clerkship is great, why a state trial court clerkship would be especially beneficial to you as a law student going into the legal field. The opportunities that it's going to open up for you and also the practical aspects of it. And I'll just say very quickly before I transition to the panelists, the practical aspect is this. If you are going to practice in California, you are going to be using California law. So this gives you a clerkship with the trial court, gives you the ability to understand the law behind the scenes before you go out into practice and actually apply the law. And it gives you the opportunity to meet with and mentor and receive the appropriate mentorship from judicial officers. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to Judge Armen Tamzarian to do a quick introduction and then to launch us into this discussion. So thank you.
Well, as far as an introduction about myself or about the field in general, would you like?
You could start with the introduction about yourself and then lead into the field and specifically why the clerkship with the trial court.
Okay. Well, after I graduated from law school, the first job I had was with a firm that I had summered with in my second year, and I didn't like it. I didn't think I was going to get a lot of experience doing meaningful work. I was going to answer interrogatories, maybe take a couple of depositions for years, and I just didn't like it, and I thought I wanted to do something else. And I got a job as a research attorney for the Superior Court, and that turned out to be a great decision for me. It paid a little less money than the job at the law firm, but I learned a tremendous amount in a really short period of time, and I truly believe it made me a much better lawyer after I had that experience. And then I went to private practice, and I was an associate and a partner in a firm. And ultimately, I became disillusioned with private practice for a variety of reasons. And I wanted to do something else. And I applied for and obtained a position as a lead appellate court attorney with the California Court of Appeal. And I love that job too. And it really changed my life. I realized that I love being a neutral much more than an advocate. And that eventually led to my job as a judge. I would have never been a judge had I not worked at the Court of Appeal for about 5.5 years. So that's my background.
Well, Judge Tamzarian, I want to ask a question based on what you said, and just in light of some of the interviews that I've been a part of for hiring. When you went from private to the clerkship, were you worried that you're going to be seen as less of an attorney? Were you worried about that at all? Or that maybe like you're not going to be practicing attorney? Did that matter to you at all? And then how were you able to process that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You're saying that my first job at the Superior Court. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of people, this might not be for you. A lot of people don't understand what this is. They clerk, they think, oh, it's a clerical position or something, and you just got to get by that. I did far more sophisticated, complicated, difficult work it was called a research attorney back then because they're just a different structure, how the court hired people. But I loved it. You know, I will tell you, the people I worked for, they eventually became my partners, really appreciated my perspective as a research attorney. So when I was there, I was only, you know, a baby lawyer, 2 or 3 years out. Much more senior people who are much better lawyers than I was would come to me and they'd want me to read their papers, or they want to run an argument by me because I had the perspective of what it takes to win in court in a way that was far beyond my years of practice. And they knew that. So when you're an advocate and all you do is your only experiences as an advocate, sometimes it's easy to believe your own rhetoric and to really be able to step back and to think, all right, how do I really get this in front of the court? What's the best presentation? You know, I have 500 or 600 cases now. I get an enormous amount of paper. I don't have the time to go through all of the paper that parties send to me. They obviously don't look at things from the perspective of the court. But if you work as a research attorney, you really understand on an intuitive level what persuades the court, what's the best presentation, get right to it. And those skills I picked up by working for about 1.5 years at the Superior Court at the beginning of my career.
Thank you so much for that response, because I think, again, just culturally, we promote federal clerkship and we say, you know, it's okay if you're not going to be practicing immediately because there's a prestige element. But thank you for kind of demystifying that for us as it relates to a state trial court clerkship and just what it does for you, especially the leverage that you now have or you had then as a practitioner. So Sarin, I want to transition to you. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and then how you ended up at the San Francisco Superior Court, because that's something very unique. If on the one hand, we're saying, you know, think beyond federal clerkships, we also want to drive the point, think beyond LA. So if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I went to law school on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. And the summer before my last year of law school, I actually interned in a federal court in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan in Detroit. And that was really my first perspective of what a clerkship was. My day-to-day interning was with the career law clerk who worked for the judge that I was interning for, Judge Friedman. And that was really the first time I really understood what a clerk does. Day-to-day communication with a judge, and like Judge Tamzarian said, being able to really sit and speak on behalf of the court and make recommendations in the perspective of a court as a neutral. I found that to be such an incredible opportunity, and that really is what drove me to pursue a clerkship post-graduation. Having the opportunity to build a close relationship with a judge, but also being able to practice and really hone your legal research and writing and ability to make a confident recommendation to a judge. That was something that was incredibly, it was something I really wanted to do. So after that, I applied to the San Francisco Superior Court, mainly because of the structure of the court. And it is a little bit different from the Los Angeles Superior Court. The San Francisco Superior Court is largely a department-based court. So it has departments based on a subject matter. So we have a department for, let's just say housing, family law, etc. And if you're hired as a clerk, you are placed in one of those departments. So if you do have you're leaning towards a particular area of the law, being able to apply for a clerkship position in a specific department was really something I saw to be beneficial. I'm lucky enough, in my opinion, to sit in the presiding judge's department, which is also a floater pool for the court. So I really get to float to different departments and able to, be exposed to different areas of the law.
Thank you for that. And so if you could just talk very quickly about what your transition to San Francisco has been like before I transition to Ani, because both of you came from the East Coast. And so what has that transition been like for you? Not just from a law student's perspective, where you're now uprooting yourself from the East Coast, everything you developed, connections, whatever, was in the East Coast, you moved back to the West Coast, and then you moved into San Francisco. So what has that adjustment been like for you?
Sure. Well, I think the professional adjustment I needed to make was, I'm entering a court where I don't know anybody. I haven't made professional contacts with really anybody who sits in the court. So I don't think it was a difficult transition. I think it was a very beneficial one because you not only learn to network with people who are new, but in the perspective of a law clerk who needs to make a connection with multiple judges that I've never met before, and needing to gain their trust with regard to the work I'm performing, it wasn't a difficult transition. You know, I think it being in law school and a law student, needing to transition to the amount of work you're doing in law school, and you know, really making contact with your professors as well, it was a very similar experience. So really, the geographical switch from East Coast to West Coast also wasn't that difficult for me, just because I'm from Los Angeles. I went to an undergrad at UCLA, so I was familiar with, you know, California. So the transition really wasn't difficult.
Thank you. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think I also clerked for the Colorado Court of Appeal. And so I remember when I sat down with my professor, she told me, what geographic restraint do you have? You have no financial burden, no family, you have nothing really. I mean, you have family and community here, but nothing that is permanent. You could uproot yourself anytime you want. Go after the opportunities that are available. And so the reason I wanted you to talk about that, Sarin, is again, kind of demystifying that we tend to follow things that we just know about and are confident in, but we don't allow ourselves to go outside of that comfort zone. And so that's why I kind of wanted you to talk about that, just so that they see, look, the transition can be smooth. You're getting the same skill set. These are the opportunities that are before you. And so Ani, if you could talk a little bit about your background and then your move also to LA Superior Court and why LA Superior Court.
Sure. I guess having externed with a judge during law school, I was in Boston when I externed with a federal court district judge. I already knew that I adored being a fly on the wall during sidebar, for instance, when attorneys would gather and discuss case law with the judge, or during lunchtime when I'd be a pest and bug my judge in her chambers about certain analysis. So I already knew that there was an affinity there towards writing and research that I wanted to further explore in law school, and I didn't necessarily restrict myself geographically because Zepur, like you said, I viewed it more as a testing field to explore different cities while in law school to see what would be a best fit, not only geographically, but also just experimenting with different positions. So the summer of my 2L, for instance, I was a summer associate at a law firm, and I pursued that because I didn't want to rely on the narratives of others. I wanted to test it out for myself, dip my toes in different things and see what worked with my personality, what it was that attracted me to certain fields. So I realized with that opportunity that I didn't necessarily enjoy it. It felt more in line with, if it's not a hell yes, then it's a no. And so I ended up declining an offer for a post-grad position, and much to the dismay of, let's say, my career counseling advisors or friends who thought I was being completely irrational, because when you go from, let's say, a law firm to a job like this, there is a pay cut, for instance. So you have to also consider the practical side of things. But I intuitively knew that it was the right decision, and I knew that this is what I wanted, and I opened myself up to that level of earnesty and authenticity. And so shortly afterwards, this clerkship opportunity gracefully fell into my lap, and I immediately applied after I stumbled upon it when I was at a career panel at school similar to this one, although that was pre-COVID and in person. So that was sort of my path. And so I'd say it's not necessarily a good idea to restrict yourself geographically, especially when you are in law school and testing out different fields.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that also, just in terms of the other opportunities that you were available, but you still chose to pursue the clerkship. And so with that, Judge Tamzarian, I want to start with you. You mentioned neutrality. You went from being an advocate where you take a side to now being a neutral arbiter, and you're objective and you're really seeking to do justice according to the law. How did you transition from that advocacy component to the being neutral? And what are the appropriate skill sets to develop to kind of harness that? Because it is a very different skill set to have. So what does it look like?
Yeah, to me, that was an easy transition. It was actually going the other way, going from a research attorney to an advocate that was harder. My partners would tell me I don't eat enough red meat, and I'm just writing too neutrally and not like an advocate. So it depends on your personality. Some people like being an advocate, so you have to just really think about that. In my experience, litigation in the superior court level too often degenerates from a debate to a street fight. And if you are in private practice, you've got to have thick skin. It's tough. I could do it, but I'd come home at the end of the day and I just wouldn't be happy. Appellate work's a little nicer, it's not as brutal, but so one of the advantages of working for the court is the atmosphere. There's no competition. Nobody's trying to make more money than the other person. Nobody's trying to win or lose. We're just here to do justice. So everybody's very cordial. And in the beginning, it's really tough because there's a big learning curve. But once you get by that, your work-life balance is much better than private practice. It's a great way to launch a career, but there's something now that's going on that didn't really exist when I got out of law school, and that is at the superior court level, you can have a career as a research attorney, which is great. You could also have a career at the Court of Appeal. So these are viable options. You're never going to become really wealthy, but it's also steady work. There is a defined benefit pension plan. This is something that doesn't exist in private practice. So you can make a good living, have a good work life balance, and really do meaningful work that makes a difference. So to me, it's a really great option for the right person.
But even let's say it's a student who wants to go into litigation, why a clerkship first? If any of you can attest to that, and you could start it off, Judge Tamzarian.
Well, like I tried to say, just my own experience, you will become a much better lawyer. For one thing that how do we say this to law students? When you graduate law school, you don't know what you're doing. You really don't know anything. You don't know how to practice law. You know enough to take a bar exam. So the really good lawyers have to be trained by someone. Now, some of the big firms, they have really good training programs, some big government agencies, maybe the Attorney General's office and so on. So you have to learn somewhere. If you spend time in the court, you will learn a great deal and you will forever be a better lawyer because of it. So it is worth the investment, even if you want to go out and start your own firm one day. People who go out and start their own firm right out of law school, it's hard to be a good lawyer. There are some who can do it. They're just really smart. They pick up things, but you really have to learn somewhere. And this is a wonderful place to learn.
I really appreciate that you touched on training, because that's something that we forget. What I've noticed with a lot of the attorneys who are either coming into the court or who are leaving the court, and then I maintain communication with them, there's a lack of training when it comes to private sector. Because again, they're just focused on getting the job done and going to the next case. It's very business oriented. Here, it's not money driven, it's not business driven. So there is a luxury of time to build the skill set. So for an example, with the LA Superior Court, any attorney who comes in, it's an at least 2-week period of training with a supervisor. And that supervisor monitors your work product and works with the judicial officer to see, are we reading and interpreting their performance consistently? If we are, then we essentially graduate them out of that training unit and then move them into the actual department. And then even then the training doesn't end. There's always a supervisor with that attorney monitoring that attorney's work up until the point where they don't need a lot of guidance. And then it's just a relationship between the attorney and the judicial officer. So there is a significant development, not only with the supervisor, but also with the judicial officer, who's going to be with that attorney for about 2 to 2.5 years if that person is with the LA Superior Court. So if Sarin, you and Ani can talk about what has the training look like for you, and then how have you developed during your clerkship, that would be great.
I'll go ahead. So like Judge Tamzarian said, after graduating law school, I came into this job with very, very little training on what this clerkship would be like. And really the first month of my clerkship was not only shadowing the research attorney who sat in my seat before, because she took a permanent position in the court, so she was able to really train me on what work I would be doing. But also, there is a lot of trust that's put in you as a law clerk. Being able to take the lessons that you're being given on a day-to-day basis, how to read a certain motion, how to interpret arguments that are being made and really come to a well-reasoned conclusion. In my case, after my training for the month that I started my job, after that, I really had to adapt to the training and be able to sit in the seat as a neutral and perform work in a way that really, as a law student, you're not really sure, you're built as an advocate in law school. You're not really trained as a neutral. So my training among, sitting in the seat of the person who was sat there before me really was so beneficial. But then thereafter, being able to do this independently was really rewarding. And if I had any questions, and you're not really left on your own either. If you have any questions, you're able to speak with, your supervisor or the person who trained you, and learn the additional lessons as you go on in your job.
Yeah, I would add to that there was a training process, and that's largely beneficial because in law school you are taught the adversarial mode of thinking, and so the transition from, let's say, writing persuasively to writing with a neutral tone was something to adopt and to learn. Also for the appellate division, for instance, learning the standards of procedure was also of review. Sorry, was also something to grapple with and acquire as a skill set, because you're not necessarily taught things from that point of view in law school. And I'd say that after the training process, it was very much an office hour procedure with my judge, in a sense, because if you think of it as you constantly going into their chambers and sitting down and analyzing the law and being able to, in a collaborative way, drive an opinion piece from start to finish through the editing process, that's a very collaborative process, and you have to be willing to be open to the changes made, for instance, to your writing style or to the editing process, the analysis that you have. That's one thing I've learned was very different from, let's say, the law firm experience that I've had, where it was very much a competitive adversarial position that you always had to take, and that does take a toll on you personality-wise. But when you're in an environment that's a bit more nurturing and are able to explore in a cerebral way the law and how it applies to the certain facts in front of you, that makes for a more, in a sense, academic, cerebral environment, and I've enjoyed that tremendously. And it's been a very nice learning experience and very nurturing in an academic sense for those who are nerds like me and really enjoy sifting through and having the nose to the grindstone with case law and having Westlaw be your best friend, for instance.
Well, just to add to the training, I mean, I work collaboratively with my law clerk all the time. So today I looked at a draft of an order that he wrote. I made a lot of changes to it, and I called him in and I said, here are the changes I made, and here's why, and here's my thinking. And that is training. And I have an open door policy where I tell my law clerk, I want you to tell me when you think I'm wrong. I don't want somebody to just agree with me. Sometimes I agree and I think, that's a good point. And other times I don't. Ultimately, I have to take responsibility for the order, but it's a collaborative process. And to me, that's gold for a young lawyer. That's how you learn.
I agree 100%. There's a level of intimacy because no one else, like what I loved about my position, especially at the Court of Appeal, I was assigned to one judge. That means that his entire attention was only on me. And he was brilliant. What he did was most of the judges would share between, like, they would have 2 law clerks. This judge purposely chose to have only one so that his entire focus would be entirely on me. That's a unique and rare gift to have because you're not going to get that elsewhere. And talk about confidence, it's a huge confidence booster. I remember coming back and I know another judge, like even before when I was in law school, when I returned to the court, she said, do you realize how much your confidence has increased? Like, you just speak with authority. Like, whenever you're making a decision or making a recommendation, you are speaking with authority. But that's because I had a year of mentorship where he was really drilling and asking me questions and telling me to look at things, or I would be the one to ask him questions. I mean, one of the things that Judge Tamzarian said, and I genuinely appreciate from a judge, is don't be the yes person, but instead be the person who is constantly seeking for truth. There's like you're inquisitive. And so before we go into the qualifications or what makes a good law clerk, assuming then a lot of our attendees are buying into our message that please consider a trial court clerkship, what do you think they could do now to prepare for a clerkship in terms of, should they do an externship with the courts? Do you think that's a requirement? What other things could they do to create an application that is marketable for this position?
Well, I sit on the committee in LA County Superior Court that screens applicants and decides whether we're going to interview them. So, one of the things you can do is get yourself a really good writing sample. We really look at it. And especially if it's a writing sample that wasn't edited by a lot of other people. It's remarkable how many applicants we see that have writing samples that have basic grammatical mistakes, typos, just really sloppy. This is all we're looking at. So I would work on that as far as your application. I think an externship is great, especially if you are an extern in the court you're applying to, because we'll call up that judge. How did this person do? And if you make a good impression, that really increases your chances of getting in. I would say something else too that doesn't really increase your kind of resume, but it's a real practical thing. And that is, when you're in law school, a lot of people after their first year, they just rely on these commercial outlines that just give you kind of the outline of what the law is. And they stop reading cases. And I think that's a mistake. I know you don't have time in law school to read every case that's in the case book, but reading cases is really hard. It's not, it's better now. Judges write in a little more approachable prose, but that skill is something you should work on, because, even if you're at a law firm, if you have a 50-page case, you need to get right to the heart of it, figure out what's important. Do I need to read more? The only way to learn that is by doing, and you can do that in law school. That will help you practice law better, and help you be a law clerk.
Thank you for that. Before I transition to Ani and Sarin, I do want to emphasize, if you think about it, the 2 main skill sets for a law clerk position is legal research and writing. So if you know that those are the 2 things that we will be doing every day, day in and day out, and afterwards I'll ask the panelists to discuss more what their day-to-day looks like. But if those are the 2 tasks that we are all doing, then you need to figure out what experience do you have that matches up with that skill set. And like Judge Tamzarian said, it's how are you still reading the cases? I'll also mention that what we notice, bar passage rate too, the ones that actually keep doing what they are tasked to do during law school tend to have a higher passage rate than those who just stop, because you then lose that discipline. Legal research and writing is a discipline. So the more you do it, the more you are working, you really develop. I could even say right now as a supervisor, my writing is not as good as what it was a few years ago because I don't write as much. So it's a skill set where it's almost like you use it or you lose it. It's like exercising. And so I do want to transition to Sarin and Ani and say, what did you do to prepare for your application? What do you think allowed you to come on board at the San Francisco and an LA Superior Court?
Yeah, I think two really important things. First, if you think you're at all interested in a clerkship, I would apply to be a judicial extern or intern. I think, that's the way I really built my interest in pursuing a clerkship post-graduation. I thought to myself, I'm interested to see how the court works. This is something that not a lot of attorneys get to do, sit in a courtroom on a day-to-day basis and really understand how a court operates. So if you're interested at all in pursuing a clerkship post-graduation, really do, put an application together and apply to an internship. I think when I was in law school, I applied to, 10 or more internship positions in order to secure, a position before I graduated as a summer internship position. So if you're at all interested, definitely, pursue that. And secondly, I'd like to echo what Judge Tamzarian said with regard to reading cases while you're in law school. That is a skill set that is so critical to being a law clerk. Your job is to make a recommendation. Part of your job is to make a recommendation to a judge on multiple motions that are on calendar. If there's an issue, that issue, the judge really puts his or her trust in you to find a case that's directly applicable. And I guarantee you what the judge will ask you is, what's the rule of the case? What does the court say about this case? How is it applicable to this motion that you're saying, this case helps your recommendation? So being able to read a case and be able to parse out the important parts of it, what the rule of the case is so important to being a law clerk. So reading your cases in law school, and for me, when I would prepare my outlines for my finals, for example, being able to have a list of cases with the rule of the case is a skill set that I use every day being a law clerk, being able to do my research and find a case that's applicable to the motion that I'm working on and finding the rule that's applicable. And in addition, practicing your legal research skills, very, 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 very important. Being able to navigate Westlaw, which comes in your legal research and writing class when you're a law student.
Yep. A lot of the students in my class, for instance, took the legal and research and writing courses as a joke, and I can't say enough how structurally it does mirror this type of job, because you learn how to navigate Westlaw. You have the one-on-one attention that's available to you during law school to work on writing as your craft and be able to polish your writing, and at the end of it, perhaps even produce a good writing sample that you could stand proudly behind when it comes time to apply to a position such as this. I remember I held myself accountable to every single word that I submitted when it was time to submit a writing sample for this position. I'd also echo that an externship was immensely helpful in not only the skill sets that you're able to learn as an extern, but also again, dipping your toes into something and trying to figure out if it's a good fit for you. There's no other way to go about it than to experience it yourself and to experiment with various positions during law school to then be able to know what you'd like to do in your postgraduate career trajectory. And so externships were very, very helpful with that.
Thank you. I will clarify that in case, like for those of you who might be 3Ls and you think, oh my gosh, I didn't do an externship. What am I going to do? But I still want to apply. Don't worry. My entire background in law school was public interest, because I thought that's the route that I was going to take. So I never entertained an externship with the court, never entertained any work in the private industry either. So don't think about, well, if I didn't do it, then now I'm out of the running. No. It's that though, for those of you who do have the opportunity, not only are you going to start kind of getting that exposure to the skill set as well as that relationship building with the judicial officer, but also you're going to see the inner workings of a court. And it might spark that interest. But if you don't have that opportunity now because of your time, don't worry about it, because bottom line, I think what all of us are saying is, focus on the writing. And one of the things is that often we forget that as lawyers, I think we always think it's that, oh, they talk well, they speak well, it's all about talking, oral advocacy. That's not true. It's actually written advocacy. What wins a case is written advocacy, not oral advocacy. So whether you're going to be here or you're going to be a litigator, it's the written advocacy that's going to drive your case forward, not what you say. And so with that, Judge Tamzarian, if you could just tell us, what does your day-to-day look like in terms of your relationship with the law clerk? And then I could also ask Sarin and Ani to talk about their relationship with their judicial officers. What does your day-to-day look like? But we could give at least a judicial perspective.
Well, I'm lucky that my law clerk is about 10 feet from me. So, he works at home 3 days a week, and that works for me. It's fine. We talk, but we talk every day essentially. My job would be miserable if I did not have a really good, reliable person in that position. I think of it as a collaborative relationship, and I don't know if there's much more to say. It's just I really enjoy, and you have, part of the thing we do when we interview people for a job is you have to enjoy working with the person too. So, that personality, he's easygoing, we collaborate, we're here to do justice. I'm really happy that he's here. So that's
what would you say his responsibilities are as it relates to you?
Well, what you do in the Superior Court is for me, he drafts memoranda, and the memoranda will summarize what the different arguments are, and he'll draft a proposed order. That's the essence of what he does. He's got a lot of volume, so it's hard to spend a lot of time on each case. So some cases we spend more time, other cases we spend less, but that's what he's doing. He's doing the drafting. Sometimes I just adopt his language. Other times I edit it quite a bit. It depends. At the Court of Appeal, the little secret is the justices simply cannot do their own writing, with very rare exceptions. So they have an army of lawyers there. In Division 3, with 4 justices, we had 15 lawyers. When I was there, I ghost wrote maybe, 30 published cases. I'll never get credit for those cases, but I'm very proud of that work. And basically, almost word for word, I wrote those opinions. Now, the justices are rightfully the authors because they take responsibility for it. They do edit it, and ultimately they have to make the decision. But that's what you do. And I think at the Superior Court level too, you write proposed orders and you summarize what's going on, and then you discuss with the judge, well, what about this? What about that? So it's analyzing, it's writing, it's reading. That's what you do.
Thank you. And Sarin and Ani, if you could talk about your day-to-day as well.
Sure. Mine is largely driven by drafting proposed opinions. And so that entails familiarizing myself with the appellate briefs. So an appellant's brief, a respondent's brief, and sometimes possibly a reply brief. Familiarizing myself with the general area of the law and the precedent that's available to me given the topic. Like I mentioned, having Westlaw be my best friend, and so really heavily relying on cases and statutes and being able to learn how to interpret certain statutes. If you enjoy annotating books, for instance, you'd like this type of position because, again, your nose is to the grindstone and you have a voluminous lots of cases and statutes to go through, but at the end of the day, it's very cerebral and very collaborative because, again, you propose an argument, an analysis, and then that's edited with your judge, and you get to see how a draft is taken all the way to a final published opinion, and that's really beautiful to see.
Ani, if you could touch a little bit more about, you're in a trial court, but you're within an appellate division. So what does that look like and what does that mean?
It's sort of, I'll give you like an example. So if there's, let's say, a city ordinance that we have on public parks, and the ordinance says that a person is, let's say, prohibited from remaining or staying between the hours of A and B. You sort of sit down and analyze what would the plain meaning of the terms, for instance, to remain or to stay be. And then you sort of see, does the legislature have something to say about the wording of this? How are we as the appellate division to interpret this? And so you do rely heavily on precedent and case law, and are able to then craft an opinion that is subject-wise the way to go with it. So
I think what might be confusing to somebody in law school is that in the Superior Court, there are certain cases that are appealed, certain kinds of cases to an appellate division within the Superior Court and not to the Court of Appeal. So that's what Ani would be doing. She would be working on those cases.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, because that's what I kind of wanted them to see, that if there are still some people who are interested in appellate, because appellate is very different. With a trial, you're just cranking out. You're really like, it's like an assembly line. With appellate, it's a lot more cerebral. You take the time and dig deeper into the law, dig deeper into the case. It's more voluminous in terms of documents, but also you have more time, luxury of time. So it's kind of focusing on a different skill set. They're both honing your writing skills, but a little bit differently. And so that's what I wanted to show, that even within the trial court system, if you're more interested in the appellate aspect of work, there's that as well. And then Sarin, if you could talk about what you do, because you're a floater. I know you touched upon it a little bit, but if you could talk a little bit more, like, what does that truly look like? Because I think for you, it's not just the ability to read and write, but there's a significant aspect of adaptability.
Yeah, definitely. So as a law clerk in the floater pool, essentially what that means is my home is the presiding judge's department. That's where I sit as a law clerk on my day-to-day. But if there's an attorney, let's just say in the housing department, who is taking, 3 months maternity or paternity leave, I, as a floater, would be responsible to floating to that department and covering all of that attorney's work. So it is a great deal. It's very important to be adaptable, because you are floating to a department where maybe you don't have any experience in dealing with motions in that specific subject matter, like housing. Maybe I've never dealt with an unlawful detainer case, a landlord-tenant related case, or maybe there's a case that has to do with commercial property sale, and that's something I've never experienced before. The judge could acknowledge that, but sometimes the judge doesn't really acknowledge that and really trusts you to do the necessary research in order to be familiar enough to make a confident recommendation on any motion. So I can say that in the last, 1.5 years, I floated to almost every department in our court, whether that be housing, our asbestos department, our civil harassment department, our law and motion department. I think there's about 8 or 10 departments in our court, and I've had to float to all of those departments and really become familiar with all of those areas of law. And that has been incredibly rewarding, because I can say now confidently, I must feel like I'm a small expert in all of these little areas of law that I, even during law school, wasn't very familiar with.
Well, let me ask you, and Sarin, how did you deal with the intimidation factor? Because you both came straight out of law school. You are definitely acknowledging the weight of the responsibility you have. How do you reckon with that? How do you, overcome that intimidation factor?
Well, I think for me, it was really important to remember that while a judge is a judicial officer, and that, does require a large amount of respect, this judge is also a person just like me, who has to make decisions based upon the law. So when I'm thinking of, is the judge gonna like my recommendation? How am I gonna be able to explain this, to a judge confidently and not be really nervous on making a recommendation, and then being able to back up what's coming out of my mouth? And I think in order to prepare for that, really you just need to remember that a judge is not looking to criticize you. They are looking for, some judges really do look for the right answer. They expect the right answer from you. So being able to go to a judge and say, this is my recommendation and this is all the law that backs up my recommendation, here's my analysis. Having that in your tool belt when you go into the judge's chambers to, speak with him or her, was a good way for me to kind of relax. And if also you learn, if a judge disagrees with you, which has happened to me, that doesn't necessarily mean they think you're wrong. Maybe they just have a different interpretation of the case or the motion. So you really also learn that when a judge disagrees with you, there's no need to kind of pull back or take a step back and think, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not a shot to your confidence. It's rather just an opportunity to, be collaborative with the judge and try to understand what he or she, where he or she is coming from as well.
Yeah, there's a certain reverence there, but there's also a built-in mentorship in this position. And one of the best ways to overcome the intimidation factor, because it for certain exists, but it's to realize that you are part of a team. You are learning from an expert, but at the same time, both you and the judicial officers have an overarching thing in common, and that's your love for the law and how best to interpret law. And so that drives the relationship forward in such productive ways because, like we mentioned, it's very collaborative. You get to be part of an editing process that not only sharpens your own personal skills as a writer, but also helps you feel fulfilled at the end of the day that you're contributing to something in a sense greater than yourself. And yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think definitely that coming into the job with a very different mindset, where you are there to pursue a cause, and that cause is really to make sure that you're getting the right answer. Okay, again, I mean, it's justice seeking. That's what's so great about this position. I saw that one of the questions was, well, is there a minimum requirement for a GPA or where you go to school? And I'll have Judge Tamzarian respond to that before I fully open it up to more Q&A. But I don't know if Judge Tamzarian, you could start with that question.
The short answer is no. I mean, we look at grades, we look at what school you went to, but we look at the big picture. So I think the court has a less snobby attitude than, say, big law firms. So we'll hire people who didn't go to top schools, but they've got to be a good writer. They have to be a good student at their school. They have to show other things. So there's no minimum. But if you don't feel comfortable writing, then maybe this isn't for you. Let me just add one more thing about this. This is an Armenian Bar presentation, and there is something I will say just personally why I like doing what I do. I'm sure I'm older than just about everybody here, but when I was a kid growing up, there was no independent Armenia. I was surrounded by survivors of the genocide. I was angry and upset and frustrated at this massive crime that had been committed, and there was no justice. There was no justice for my grandparents. There was nowhere to go in the Ottoman Empire for all the things that happened even before the genocide. There was no rule of law. And sometimes you feel helpless that you can't do anything. The one thing I really believe in is the rule of law. The one thing that separates this country from Lebanon during the Civil War, from what has happened in Iran after the revolution in terms of minority rights, is that we have the rule of law. And we can't make everything right, but being part of the court that promotes the rule of law really does make the lives of everyday people better. It really does. I really believe that. And we all come from a background where there was no rule of law that protected us, no matter where you come from, really, as an Armenian to this country. So there is something that I find solace in this job. I find that I am doing something meaningful. And, if you work as a lawyer or a law clerk in the court, you're part of that. you know, you may not become wealthy, but there is something satisfying about that. Although it's not bad. I mean, a career position, you can make a good living, but it's not the big bucks. So is this right for you? Do you want meaningful work? And if the answer is yes, I want meaningful work. I like to write. I like the intellectual challenge, then this is a good place for you.
Right. And on top of all that, you do maintain a very good work-life balance. I mean, there comes a point where you really can be in control of your calendar and master it in a way where you get to manage your time very effectively. So I think this is the job. I mean, I see it. I had a lot of my attorneys leave and go into private practice and then want to return so badly. So I see that. I know that we might be money driven, but then there's a cost to that as well. You know, for those who are making, 200 grand or whatever, you work for every penny of that. And then when I hear how attorneys are treated and they're treated less than as like humans, they're really just treated as workhorses. It gives you a different perspective. And I really appreciate what Judge Tamzarian said. When I go to work, my conscience is clear because I do not need to take a side. The only side that I'm taking is the side of the law. We are there to really interpret the law and give it its due honor and its due respect. And I'm very grateful that also you connected that with the mission of the Armenian Bar Association. We're here today. What binds us is not only our interest in the law, but also just who we are as Armenians and our ancestry and what we've gone through and why the law is so important. Every justice that we've been seeking, we've been trying to do it through the rule of law. And it gives us that unique opportunity to actually apply it here within the court system. So thank you for that. And I don't see any other questions in the Q&A, but I am going to open it up to all questions right now. So if you ask more questions, we'll be able to respond to them. And I know, I don't know if Krikor is here, but I know we wanted to go into a breakout room, but I don't know if there's that too. So if you have any questions, please send us. Okay, I see a question. Oh, not really. So Kiko, I don't know if we want to move it. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, please let us know. And also we're available outside of outside of this session as well. Okay, let me see. Okay, do you clerks aspire to be judges one day? Yes.
I will say, while being in law school, that was not really a career path that I considered. But I think now more and more as I'm a clerk in the San Francisco Superior Court, and after this job, I intend to pursue or continue clerking afterwards. I'm realizing more and more that this is something that I love to do. I really do, and I think it's such a beneficial job. So I guess the short answer is maybe ? But I think this job is definitely, if that was the path I intended to take, I would only realize that doing what I do now. So I hope to continue what I'm doing and, maybe in the future.
I feel too modest answering that, but I will say that of all the legal professionals that I've encountered, both in law school and in postgraduate life, I would say that I admire judges the most.
And one of the other questions we have is, can you talk about your personal work-life balance? Are you working on briefs late into the night?
I think that's really for us. The three of you.
Yeah. Sarin and Ani, do you have anything?
Sure. I think it ebb and flows. I think there's some weeks, I would say largely I'm out of the office by 5 o'clock. But it really all depends on how you're able to manage your calendar. I think in the beginning when I started working, There were definitely days I stayed after 5 o'clock. It's not like I would work until, you know, the midnight hour. That's really never happened. But really with time, you learn what you need to get done in a day to be able to leave, you know, your work by 5 o'clock. And really my work never really comes home with me unless, you know, we have a really busy week, which doesn't really happen that much. So I think maintaining a work-life balance as a clerk is something that's very attainable.
Well, let me just say, in contrast to private practice, there's no comparison, right? I remember I worked at this Century City firm, and I remember going down the escalators at around 6 o'clock, and a partner going up the escalators telling me, "Oh, putting in half a day," you know, that kind of thing. And you know, once you get past the initial learning curve, your hours are not going to be crazy private practice hours where there's crazy emergencies happening. It's just an even flow. It's better. That's my experience.
I agree with you 100%. This is what I tell the attorneys. Your first 6 months are the most crucial time. So what you want to do is you want to develop your skill set. Well, that takes time. So don't expect, I mean, the actual work hour is 8 to 5. Those are the defined work hours. But you're also salaried. So it doesn't mean you're gonna end work at 5. No, especially when there's a huge learning curve, you will be working until 7, 8 in the beginning. And I'm not going to be concerned about that. I'm not going to be concerned about your work-life balance during the first 6 months. I will keep checking on you. I would hope that by the 3rd month, you're a lot better than the 1st month. And then by the 6th month, whatever issue you had at the 3rd month mark is not there. At the 6th month mark is when I come in and I say, let's see what you're doing. Because if those issues of time are still there, then we need to figure out what's the cause and what's the reason behind it. Once we figure that out, then I also project another 6 months out, because then I give you a full 1 year. So it really is, I mean, you have to manage your expectation. In every job, when you first start, you're always going to work much harder. I mean, I could tell you, I don't work the way I used to work. And I don't need to. I've gotten to a place where I'm now comfortable and I don't need to. And I'm also a lot faster. I think that's the other thing. You build up speed inherently. And when you build up speed, you realize how much more time you have. So I think there is a misconception where a lot of people come in assuming, well, they're just not going to work as much. That's not true, because also your job is a huge responsibility. I would say more so than the attorney with the client, because you're really helping decide the outcome of a case that affects both parties and both clients and both attorneys. So it's the responsibility is much greater. So then the time allocated to it is also going to be much greater in the beginning, up until you pick up, you know, that skill set, and then you're going to pick up speed, and you're going to see that you can leave at 5 o'clock. Most of our attorneys do leave by 5 o'clock. And then also the pay, just to clarify, when we're saying a pay cut, the pay cut is only initially. It's when you start off as a law clerk. What's different about the LA Superior Court is that you start off as a law clerk for 2 years. The contract is for up to 2.5 years, but between the 18-month mark and the 2-year period, you are now eligible to become permanent. And if you become permanent, then by the 2-year mark, you become a research attorney, and your pay is in the 6 digits. And you get 2 streams of pension. That's tremendous. And they match both. One is like 4%, one's like 8%. So I couldn't believe my friend who works at a huge firm, their pension was cut this year. Their 401k was cut this year. There was no matching. That's not the case when you work for the government. So it also gives you an element of long-term stability that's not present elsewhere. And that should also give you a peace of mind. And so for us, like what Judge Tamzarian was saying, there's a peace of mind from a legal aspect. The approach is neutral, but there's also an embedded peace of mind where there's long-term job security and stability.
Yeah, in private practice, if you don't bring in clients,
right,
you're not going to stay at the firm. It's a lot less stable. There are a lot of little tyrants out there who run firms, and lawyers are just miserable under some tyrant. You don't have that in the Superior Court. You know, it's just a very different culture. So there's the benefit of that stability. And I think a lot of research attorneys who work long-term in the Superior Court do better economically than people who are going from firm to firm. You're not going to be rich, but it's a good way to make a decent living.
Right. I agree. And so one of the things I do want to conclude with, and I did receive a question in terms of sharing our contact information. We're also available on LinkedIn. So if for those of you who are comfortable, we could provide the email. Otherwise, you could find all of us on LinkedIn and then communicate with us through that as well. And I highly recommend LinkedIn. I think it's an important, especially now that the world has gone remote. You really get to build relationships remotely through LinkedIn. And so from a more practical perspective, I highly recommend that. And let me see. Let's see. Okay, LinkedIn works as well. And then does the Armenian Bar offer resume review? Yes, it does actually. And so if you email us, and I don't know, Kriko, if you could help me with the email address too, that they could send out the resumes, and we do review resumes. And we are planning at one point to also launch a workshop on resume and interview. So with that, we just want to conclude. I don't know if any of you have concluding remarks, if you want to say anything. Otherwise, we thank the Armenian Bar Association for sponsoring this event, and know that the Armenian Bar is here to support you as students, whether it is with this clerkship or any other career path you wish to take. So thank you very much for today's participation. Okay. And by the way, the email address is info@armenianbar.org, info@armenianbar.org.